Well, I think I'll go ahead and get started. There's still more people popping in, but they can pop in as that's going along. So, and Jeff, Olga is recording this because we had a couple people ask if that could happen because they had other Zoom events, and so they couldn't make it today. So there you have it. So I want to just welcome everyone for coming today, and thank Jeff so much for doing this. You know, this is a interesting time for all of us, whether we're first year, second year, had our field work disrupted, writing our dissertation, postdocs, faculty, we're all being affected by this. And I'm sure you're seeing it from every direction and all over the country. And so, you know, we don't really have a particular agenda. I'm sure you'll have ideas of things to say, and there'll be lots and lots of questions. And what I'll do at this point, Jeff, is I'll just turn it over to you, but I will monitor the text chat. And so if people have questions, Olga's recording and I'll monitor the text chat. And that way, if someone has a question that they want to do, I can always chime in so that, Jeff, you don't have to worry about monitoring the text chat as we're going along. Does that sound good?
That's awesome. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So once again, thanks so much, and take it away. And here we go.
Thanks. So just to clarify where NSF is compared to, say, Winter-Grant or SSRC or some of the other agencies, we don't have any kind of interruption in our process. We are intending to see dissertation proposals on August 15th. For reasons that we'll probably make clear to individual departments in the next couple months, we'd actually rather see proposals on August 15th than January 15th. And that's going to be the trend in the foreseeable future. Has nothing to do with, there'll be information about this down the road. This just has to do with managing proposal load in a federal agency, where the idea of a budget doesn't seem to be normal anymore. Continuing resolutions seem to be the norm. And so planning around this and trying to get academia to develop, to adjust to what is the sort of new normal of government funding cycles is what that's about. So we're trying to get more proposals reviewed in the fall in the future. Nothing to worry about in the short term, has nothing to do with COVID, it was something that we've been thinking about for a while. But we'd rather see proposals in the fall. We're still going to continue to see proposals in the spring, but we'd rather, if you have a proposal that you'd like to get out, we'd rather see it in the fall. We haven't seen an interruption like in academia. People in higher positions of authority, like deans and deanlets and provosts and vice provosts and super provosts and so forth, hold back money and then they use it for projects typically towards the end of the fiscal year. We won't have that because of COVID, but our budget is the same as it is. We have the same base funding that we did this year. We don't expect any kind of major interruptions. In terms of projects going forward, we just got the green light about 20 minutes before this meeting to go ahead and start notifying students who were successful in our spring competition that it's okay to sort of start asking for information from them in terms of IRBs and that sort of stuff with the intent to fund. If you're waiting to hear how you're doing and haven't heard, it could be good news or bad news still, but we are actually authorized to start telling people what their status is now. So those are sort of the basics. You have the advantage of just listening to me exactly when we're learning about what's going on. Yeah, I'm happy to take whatever questions you like. I'm happy to sort of talk about what impact COVID has had on research, how this is figuring in terms of our funding priorities, or whatever you want to hear first. I know you have only an hour, so if you have priorities, things that you really want to hear about now, let me know so I don't drone on unnecessarily.
Great. And I'll actually see if I can get other people to chime in and ask questions themselves. And so I'll step back. And my other little caveat that I just put in the chat is I am doing childcare at the same time with my 13-year-old dude here eating lunch. So if I mute the video for a moment, I haven't crashed. I'm just like putting away pizza or something, but don't worry, I'm here. So let's see if we can get some other folks to chime in, and the floor is ours. This is a great opportunity. Let's ask some questions.
One at a time.
It always takes a bit to hunt for the mute button.
So while you're thinking about it, I can kind of answer some frequently asked questions in the meantime.
Actually, we did get a question that someone just put in chat as well. It would be great to hear about funding priorities and how is there any possible change in that moving forward?
I don't think this is going to change our funding priorities. If I had my personal preference, which I often don't, I would never, ever, ever want to see another proposal about COVID-19 ever again. We saw over 6,000 of them at MSF in the last 2 months, about 1,500 just to the social sciences. I stopped counting in anthropology when we reached about 100. Some of them, it was usually a lot of COVID plus kinds of projects. That's not to say if you have something where COVID is relevant, you shouldn't, I say that partly I'm just, but if you have something where COVID is relevant or you're a medical anthropologist and you happen to study infectious diseases, you shouldn't see that as a disincentive. But we've seen an awful lot of projects that have tried to make themselves fit into the current historical moment. And in general, those aren't always the most compelling projects. To give you an example, when Trump was elected, there was sort of a panic in academia around certain sorts of issues, notably with DACA. We were certainly interested in the impact that certain kind of stringent immigration policies would have on DACA, on immigrant health and that sort of stuff. And we funded a number of projects relating to those sorts of questions. Sarah Horton, Winnie Duncan, Ruth Gombard-Munoz, and a number of others. We saw an awful lot of projects continuing to this day in this area, and we're just not going to fund all of them. That's not to say don't do something that's relevant to what you're doing, but don't try to make your work fit the historical moment that it's in just because you think it's going to be more compelling. Often that backfires. Often it makes something that is interesting and novel in its own right somewhat disconnected and disjointed. The projects that we're looking at, none of them have really much of anything to do with COVID because they were submitted in January of this year. And we're going to ask every single person who has a project for contingency planning around what there is that they're doing. If they can't collect the data now, can that be delayed? Do they have alternatives? That's just sort of a part of our process. The panel, when we met, we were interested in funding basic science and anthropology, and the humanity and human behavior transcends one particular kind of historical moment. Granted, this is a very significant one, but it's not the only one that we're interested in. So our priorities haven't changed. I think what you see in this kind of moment is that what we've emphasized as a program becomes a bit more punctuated. So we're not particularly into trends in the discipline, something that seems flashy because some prominent, usually French person has written about it and packs a room full of people at the AAAs when we used to meet as human beings in confined spaces. Just because that's significant there doesn't make it significant necessarily to the future of anthropological science. Uh, I think that's how this plays out here as well. We want to know. A soundbite that I often relay to students is that an awful lot of anthropologists want to be op-ed writers, and what we actually want are beat reporters. We want people to go out and do the nitty-gritty of data collection and actually learn things that move the field forward, rather than take large bodies of information and process them. Why? Because as a beat reporter, you're interested in investigating, you're interested in asking questions. As an op-ed reporter, nobody can tell you anything that to change your mind. You're already sort of solidified. You're not actually a journalist anymore. You're somebody who writes opinions. And we're interested in people that are curious, and whatever you want to be curious about is fine with us, as long as it's anthropological science.
It's a great point about the COVID thing as well. It's funny, I'm teaching this undergraduate digital cultures class right now where they're broken into 6 research groups and they're doing independent research. And we're in week 8, and I told them at the very beginning, it's your choice. If your group wants to do something related to COVID or not, I'll support you, whatever project you want to do. And out of the 6 groups, 0 decided to do something about COVID. They really wanted to not think about COVID so much and study dating apps and study online games and do TikTok and other stuff. So it's a good point about it not being all containing. We have another question that I think is leading more towards the practicalities of framing research design, which is that if someone's going to be reapplying in August, is it recommended that we incorporate COVID-19 parameters into our methodology and timelines? So it's a question less about the focus of the research, but about the methodology and timeline kind of issues. What would be your recommendations on that for people?
So projects submitted in August aren't going to be able to be funded until probably January, February. It'd be more likely the soonest start dates would be in February. Start dates for the project probably, some people start a little bit early on the project. They've already got things off the ground. But let's assume that it's a conventional project. We're not looking at anything starting until about March or April of next year. Who knows what the world looks like then, but it'll probably look different than it does now. Maybe, the Trump Foundation will have mass distributed 7 billion vaccines around the world. And everything will be just hunky-dory. Or maybe COVID-21 will be bearing down on us and creating a different set of problems. It's really hard to anticipate these things. I think, I think it's hard to write a proposal right now, for anyone to write a proposal without this in the back of their head. But I wouldn't plan your entire lives around the current kind of socially distanced life which we find ourselves in. That said, if you find yourself doing a project that's ethnography at a distance, or that uses methods that are non-conventional, and Tom and Bill Maher are excellent resources on this count, as are a number of folks at Irvine. Irvine's kind of a hub for this. We're willing to look at those sorts of proposals. There's excellent resources being crowdsourced. I'll share them with you, Tom, and you can circulate them, on people who have crowdsourced methods to use in this kind of, under these circumstances. And if that's the project that you want to do and you feel like you can do a project under those conditions, we're certainly willing to look at those proposals. And I think one of the advantages of the moment that we find ourselves in is we start asking questions about our methodologies that maybe we might not normally ask. Whether one of my other hats that I wear in NSF is I'm the point of contact for all IRB and human subjects issues at the foundation. I'm the human subjects research officer. And prior to this, work that was like sort of what they call minimal risk in the human subject world, expedited, exempt sorts of projects where you're doing stuff that's not really consequential. I can't really hurt anybody that much by speaking to them about this issue or that issue. These were kind of, passed through human subjects without too much trouble. Those have all been shut down. The things that were minimal risk suddenly are not worth doing from a human subjects protection standpoint. And then the only things that are worth doing are the things that might have more of a risk to human beings because of exposure, but the benefits are really significant. So various forms of treatment and prevention and vaccine trials and those sorts of things. Those are the only things that IRBs are looking at right now. And so the human subjects world got kind of turned on its head. If anthropology gets turned on its head too, and people start asking whether there's interesting sorts of methods that can be done to ask questions, to elicit data on questions that we hadn't thought of before, that's certainly advantageous. And I think you'll find that our reviewers are fairly responsive to that. They certainly were in the spring. And I expect that to continue. But if you have a conventional project that you wanted to do and it's just a matter of time, just say it's going to start later. If we need to say it starts 6 months after they say that a vaccine is as many as 12 to 16 months away from distribution. If the project needs to be delayed until it's safe to return there, or until there's no, until parts of it can be conducted with appropriate sorts of protections in place, you can offer those sorts of caveats. You'll see in our solicitation there's this rule written that normally projects have to start within 1 year of the submission date, and that was to prevent people from applying too early, before a project was appropriately baked. And I think under the circumstances, we're certainly not holding people to that 12-month rule, really. If it needs to start later, that's absolutely fine with us. I'm anticipating most of the start dates on the projects that I'm going to fund in this cycle are going to be pushed probably into 2021.
Then the 2 points I want to pull out of that, and then we have at least 3 more questions, which is great. I've actually been talking a lot to Daniel and Rutherford, and I have a blog post that's coming out with Wenner Gren, a group of us, about sort of fieldwork after the pandemic kind of situation. And one point you're making here that I made in my forthcoming post as well is that the February, March, April moment when fieldwork projects were suddenly stopped, people had to fly home, projects that were designed without even knowing of the existence of COVID had to get changed and so on. That time is a poor model for, hi Carter, Carter's saying hi. That time is sort of a poor model for thinking forward about research design once COVID-19 is sort of part of our social fabric for good or for ill, regardless of where we are with the vaccine or with flattening curves. It will be in mind and sort of part of the situation. And so I think we have to be careful about drawing lessons from the sort of February, March, April, May current time we're in, where things were shifted that were never planned with it in mind for the first place. And so I think that's important. Hi, Carter. Carter's saying hi to me. Hi, Carter. Okay, I say cheese. I keep talking. This is what happens with Zoom, right? The other point that you're making, I think, that is really important and that we talked about in a previous thing we did here in the department is that culture and the distance stuff that happened because World War II was also the birth of the anthropology of mass media in some ways, and sort of new opportunities came out of that. And in terms of the method things going around, like there's that fieldwork in an epidemic document that Deborah Lupton has been in charge of that's gone around, that's been a really interesting document. But what's sort of sad about that document about fieldwork and epidemic is there's hardly a single anthropologist in it. It's all sociology and communications and media studies. And that work is great, but I really want anthropology to be part of those conversations. We have real methodological and conceptual tools to offer. And I think this is a moment for us to sort of step up to the plate in that regard, because there's an enormous amount of that stuff circulating around. And it's sort of shocking how little anthropology is in that conversation. And I really want it to be there more. And so there's still this sort of, in anthropology sometimes, a sort of denigration or hostility towards digital research that is not serving us well. So we have several questions, and a couple of them are very practical and some are more sort of conceptual. I was going to do them in order. The first one, that's a more practical one that I think you sort of answered already, but just so we're clear, what about no-cost extensions being granted during COVID-19? Is there any possibility of a second one beyond the first year, depending on what's happening with COVID? What's the situation with that?
I'm approving all of them. I mean, NSF has guidance out there in coronavirus, and the directive that we have is to kind of universally approve all of them without question. As soon as the word COVID is mentioned, it's perfunctory. That said, a little secret, I don't think I've ever turned around a no-cost extension in 8 years. The only reason I turn them around sometimes is because there's only a certain number of years that you can continue to hold on to federal funds to fund something. It used to be 7 years, and then now the U.S. code is complicated, and I don't actually understand the rule. Every time I read the statute, it looks different to me. You can only hold on to federal money so long, and after that, it gets returned. And return funds do not go back to the program; they go back to the U.S. Treasury to pay down the national debt. So, something to keep in mind if you ever get an NSF grant. If you consider it your patriotic duty to pay down the national debt with unexpended funds, that's fine. Usually, you can find a good use for it for the sake of anthropology too. But I'm universally approving the cost extensions. And Tom, you're muted.
So I'm doing two kinds of muting at once. Another very practical question, but can you tell us about postgraduate research funding opportunities? Will NSF hold the usual November round of applications? Because people, obviously we're dealing with folks who are towards the end of their fieldwork time and thinking about those kinds of opportunities as well. So what's the sort of situation with that?
You mean the postdoc competition or the?
Yeah.
I haven't heard anything about that going away. That should be fine. All of this is contingent on NSF getting an appropriation, and you can read the president's budget. The president's budgets are summarily ignored by Congress. I mean, they never pay attention to them, regardless of who's in power. But there's always a cut in there to NSF with this particular administration. And the cut would be strong to the social sciences. It's never actually materialized. Both houses of Congress are fairly supportive of the work that we do. Under conditions of extreme austerity, it's anyone's guess. I mean, if we're sliding into a depression or something, your guess is as good as mine what that means. But in our history, we've never seen a material change there. There's no reason to believe that our budgets would be affected, and I don't think that would affect the postdoc competitions either.
Okay. And I'm going through these in order, so it's not like in a structured order or whatever, but it's interesting. People have really practical questions. People want to know like that kind of stuff. Interesting. But in some other disciplines, like in engineering, NSF deadlines have apparently been removed so that proposals can be submitted anytime. Could we expect a similar situation in social sciences?
There's been discussions about that in the social sciences that have nothing to do with COVID-19. There's 3 directorates that have actually introduced no deadlines, and some of the programs and the social sciences have gone to no deadline. Archaeology has always been a no deadline program. The program formerly known as Geography and Spatial Sciences, it's now Human, Environmental, and Geographic Sciences. They've gone no deadline for the last a couple of years. Biological anthropology is considering it. We've toyed with the idea, and I think we're not ready to do a no deadline competition for the feedback that we got from our panels was that that there were problems with that. And at some point I'll discuss them somewhere, but what we've seen with no deadlines is the number of applications falls through the floor. some of these programs in biosciences, for example, have trouble even generating enough proposals to fund, which has been good for us actually, because I'll have like a botanist on a project and I get like $150,000 from biosciences, from like evolutionary biology or something, which is great. But there's issues having to do with equity between programs, between time to degree. There's a number of issues that were sort of processed, and I think we want more time to kind of consider whether it's a good idea for cultural anthro. You are going to see changes to the cultural anthropology solicitation, whether they're not going to happen for August, but further down the road they'll happen. They won't be severe, but they'll the intent will be to create application pressure in the fall round rather than in the spring round. Currently, we see twice as many proposals for January 15th as we do for August 15th. We'd like to be that to be the other way, actually. So it's just too hard to process. You can see we're creeping into June here right now. I lose the capacity to fund anything in the beginning of July, and don't have the capacity to fund anything again until the beginning of October, assuming that we have budgets, and then continuing resolutions mess up everything. The window is too small to consider a high volume of projects. Siobhan and I don't have trouble with that as a program, but the various other levels of the foundation have a problem with that kind of crunch at that particular time. And so it's just a workflow management issue.
And just more structural stuff. What about the GRP? Is there any, the GRFP, I mean, like, is that being affected at all? Or, I mean, this is independent of COVID, I guess.
Think the new solicitation is out yet. I happen to be, I wear about 6 different hats. I happen to be the SPE, the social science representative on GRFP. There's a new solicitation, minor changes to it, nothing really significant. The deadline should be the same this year. We don't expect any changes.
Okay. We have several other, now we have a couple more sort of conceptual kinds of questions that are interesting. One is like, how about like ways to think about sort of engaged anthropology as something other than opinion writing? Like, how should people think about sort of the question of broader impact, I guess, in a sense, or, think about engaged anthropology, but with the sort of beat reporter mentality, I guess. Like, do you have any sort of ideas or tips on that?
I think I'd ask whoever wrote the question to kind of out themselves and tell me what they mean by engaged anthropology. And the reason is engaged anthropology can mean much different things, and some of those things are not consonant with the mission of the NSF, which is to promote basic science. Work that's primarily advocacy, for example, is outside the scope of what we can fund. And it's not just that I mean, I think as anthropologists, we share an advocacy objective for the communities that we work with, and those are often good broader impacts but they're good broader impacts at NSF because they build the capacity for anthropologists to continue to do work in these communities, not because promoting these communities is in itself a good. It is a good, but it's not what this allocation of taxpayer dollars is for. And in fact, it can actually create problems if the objective is to promote for a particular community. What that sometimes suggests is that you're cutting off the flow of information and data and questions that aren't about promoting that particular community. That you're not really interested in discovery. You come to a conclusion, and now you want to leverage what you know to advocate for this community. Important work, not science. So there's other forms of engagement there that I think are in terms of participatory methods, in terms of collaborative kinds of work and so forth, that are very much important aspects of the science that we fund. But I think I need a clear definition of what engaged was.
I think that's a great answer. And if we have more time, we can come back to it. But we have like now a whole bunch of great questions coming in. So like the floodgates are opening. And this is one that for me, even as an advisor, is a really interesting one for my graduate students. For those who are applying like this fall, that are unable to do sort of summer preliminary field work, which is often so important to developing projects. You know, how do you think NSF reviewers will take this into account? It won't really be specific to Irvine, right? I mean, everyone's dealing with this, but do you have any tips or ideas around that? Because, you know, at Irvine, like at most universities, preliminary fieldwork is a very important part of establishing, you know, figuring out the research design, getting to know local scholars, language training, on and on and on. And I could suspect that in a good number of cases that might be disrupted. So any thoughts about that?
Good question. It's not one I've gotten yet, so I'm writing it down. huh. I think well, in some ways, a lot of folks are going to be in the same boat. They're going to be in the same situation, and so there's going to be sort of a leveling effect with that. I think the way that you talk about preliminary work and the way that you carry out preliminary work in the next few months is going to be a little bit different than the way we thought about it and talked about it in the past. So the kinds of work that you can do at a distance, I think our panel. So the purpose of preliminary work is, in a purely scientific sense, is to it's designed to create what we call a proof of concept. That you know that this is a tenable concept on the ground. So going to the place and asking people questions about whether this question makes sense is a very easy way to do that. It's effective in terms of sourcing that information. And identifying whether this concept actually has validity. It's not the only way to do it. We're kind of unique as a field and sort of requiring you to go to the field. I'm always amazed that when I talk to political scientists or behavioral economists, they're amazed that I speak the languages of the field sites that I've done work in, because none of them do. You'll have somebody who says, you know, oh, I've been working in Kenya for X number of years, and I say something and then Swahili, and they're like, huh? So we're sort of unique as a field in that respect, and I say that not to undercut the value of doing on-the-ground fieldwork, but to suggest that we have set the bar fairly high for ourselves in terms of establishing a proof of concept. There's many ways to people are adopting all sorts of hobbies during this the slow apocalypse here. And some people are knitting, and some people are learning languages and so forth. And there's nothing to say you can't gain skills that would help you sort of establish yourself as a dogged researcher for a fall application. Taking an online course in data analysis, this is the perfect time to do it. There's plenty of them offered at qualquant.com. Just Google Methods Mall. It will take you to the University of Florida courses. You can finally get that course done in text analysis or social network analysis under your belt. These are great skills to have. You won't be sorry that you took them. I've done the ones in SNA and text analysis before, and quantitative analysis, stats. And they're fantastic courses. There's lots of resources out there that are free you can identify. You can do ethnography at a distance. I think everybody's going to be in this situation of having to be a little bit more imaginative of how they're developing that proof of concept. In some ways, us being sort of under house arrest, quite literally, for this period of time is to our advantage in developing skills that we wouldn't necessarily have thought. I don't have a single project in my house left to do. There's nothing. Yeah, my wife's been in India since the middle of
February. Come over to my house then, because every project is not done here. So
yeah,
you're welcome. So
I'm all by myself for the last 3 months. But everyone understands what this is. I think just get imaginative in terms of how you're getting these skills, and don't worry that every reviewer is going to be looking at the same sorts of conditions there.
Yeah. And Orlando, rather than keep reading what you're saying, why don't you in a moment come and talk, because he's asking once again about what the engaged anthropology stuff means. And this is a long-standing issue with funding, not just for the NSF, but for any research, where we all do activist and advocacy kind of work. But if it's framed in such a way that you already know what you're going to find, then it's not scientific research, and it's not going to get funded by most places, not just the NSF, because it's not research. That's the key thing. And so how do you think about the moments of activism and advocacy in one's work as related to the moments of research in one's work, and how are those shaped and linked to sort of engagement with the communities that we work with? And so NSF has been dealing with this very intelligently for a long time, as has Wintergren and SSRC and everyone else. But it's a very important question, and obviously gets refracted further in the context of COVID, where there's so much global crisis going on. So Orlando, why don't you just go ahead and say the stuff you're saying, just rather than me read the chat, because it's a very good question, and it's a nice conceptual thing to think about.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was responding to the clarification, but I guess I'm thinking of a kind of research mode where you work with the community to identify important questions, but the outcome isn't determined necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just good ethnographic work. I mean, I think that's good field work. It falls under the category of and research methods of what we would call validity in terms of the data. Anthropologists have been historically very good at doing validity, making sure that the data is valid. And if you were to take a text analysis course, for example, and you're trying to figure out how to generate codes, one tool that you could do to make sure that the codes are valid is something called an intercoder reliability test, sometimes called a kappa test. It's just a quick, number crunch to see if you and someone else who's coding your data comes up with the same sort of things. It's sort of a mainstay of a lot of different forms of qualitative data analysis. Doing this with certain communities in a more sophisticated, grounded kind of sense, and what you're calling an engaged sense, Orlando, means that it's not just that they're looking at your data and trying to code it, they're helping you frame the entire conceptual approach to the data to begin with. And that's commonly called collaborative or participatory methods, or it goes under a number of different guises. That goes to the research design. That's wonderful. I think that is very clearly helps you establish very valid methods for data collection and analysis, and absolutely is something that we want to support. Where we're reluctant, or we feel like we don't have the mission to fund that, is when the engagement is the outcome. The objective of this research is to promote rights rights for this indigenous community over their resources with respect to the state, or to promote their the preservation of their heritage or something like that. As broader impacts, those are good, but we still need to see a research question. And while I've got the floor here, I just want to introduce Siobhan. Siobhan is Cultural Anthropology co-director. I saw her come on a few seconds ago. Siobhan, you don't have to turn on your camera if you don't want. You can just unmute and say hi, but anytime you want to chime in, feel free.
Thank you, Jeff. Sorry, this was super happy, so I didn't actually turn on my camera because I don't want to contribute to anybody else's bandwidth issues. But it's nice to see you all, and Jeff is doing a great job, so I've got nothing to chime in about at this point.
Yeah.
Just to sort of make two synthetic points about what you were saying, Jeff, to what Orlando is saying as well, is two ways I think that the sort of engagement thing shows up well when grant writing for the NSF or other similar things is, number one, when it allows you to show a strong relationship between the field site and the research questions. So once again, it doesn't feel like the research questions came from a French intellectual and they were cut and pasted onto Kenya, but that the research questions are actually related to something that's actually going on empirically on the ground in Kenya, and showing that kind of relationship between the research questions in the field site is extremely important in terms of research design, because it makes it look like an interesting, feasible project. It's not just like, I'm interested in X issue and spin the bottle, hey, it landed on Italy. The coffee is good there. I'm going to do this in Italy, right? So that's one place where the engagement, I think, is good in terms of showing that you've generated research questions that have an organic relationship to the field site. And then the second thing you've mentioned is applicant capability, that showing that you can hit the ground running, that you have an engagement with the, not just in terms of language, but local scholars or the details of how the field site works. And those are two ways that engagement definitely seems like it can contribute to a robust research proposal based on what you're saying, Jeff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in some cases, you can't even do the research without demonstrating engagement. Working with Native American communities in the United States, for example, or First Nation communities in Canada, you can't, Aboriginal communities in Australia, you can't actually do the research unless you have a permit and IRB approval. With projects and other directorates, I sometimes have to remind them that just because the University of such and such has approved this IRB protocol doesn't mean that the researcher can actually do their work there. They have to actually have the Dina Navajo Nation actually approve this work. Otherwise, this is never going to get off the ground. If you're doing archaeology in Mexico, you have to work with Mexican archaeologists. It's just you can't do it otherwise. So it certainly goes to the feasibility of the issue, and it goes to the validity of the data. Absolutely.
I think I've gotten through my list of questions, so other people chime in, or you had mentioned at the outset that you had some like commonly said things. Is there anything we've missed in terms of like other sort of key points or key issues that you've heard from other people that have shown up?
I forget them now. I don't remember what I had in my head when I said that originally, but yeah, I mean, certainly people are concerned with the timelines of awards and when they can conduct the research, and that's something that's come up quite a bit. How much the other sort of common question that we're getting, particularly from dissertation, DDRIG prospective applicants, is how much of this needs to go into the research design, into the framing of the proposal for an August submission. And I mean, it'd be hard not to mention COVID-19 in a research proposal submitted right now, but keep in mind it's not the permanent state of things as far as we know, and the start dates for awards can be delayed. We can extend the life of awards really easily. The first no-cost extension that you get, it's called grantee approved, because the second UC Irvine signs off on it, it's approved. I click a box that says reviewed. That's literally all I do. And then it disappears from my list of things that I need to do. In the case where it's NSF approved in the second year, I'm the signing official, or Siobhan is the signing official. It comes in, and right now, all I'm putting in the box to justify it is COVID-19. I usually provide a more elaborate explanation. At this point, I'm handling a dozen of them a day or something, so I just don't even bother. After that, it's a higher level of approval, and I have to write a recommendation. And the Division of Grants and Agreements approves it, but they almost always follow her. So 2 years is perfunctory. I mean, it's really easy. The first year doesn't even require me looking at it. And beyond that, it's not that hard. It's hard to imagine at this point a project with a 3 4 or 5 year time frame to get done. At that point, I'd be maybe wondering whether an academic career was worth it in terms of where it fits into the longevity of a human lifespan. But if it's going to take you 5 years to conduct field work, yeah, it's really not hard to sort of extend things out, and it's really easy to work that into the research proposal. I don't think you need to say a lot in a research proposal about it, but you can.
Cool. We have a question from faculty.
Okay.
Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Lena.
Can you hear me?
Sure.
Hey, how are you?
I can always hear you.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Of course.
I have to say it's very heartening to hear your responses, so that's always good. My question has to do with how or whether you're communicating, these I don't know if they're presented as guidelines, but how you're communicating this to reviewers, especially ad hoc reviewers for proposals. Like, if there are reviewers who may have in their minds that certain projects could not be funded because of COVID-19, would that possibly impact the ratings and rankings that they submit? And would, just kind of like how you're thinking about that?
It's you'd be surprised how little of an impact it's actually had on the review of proposals. Mainly because it's kind of an all or nothing thing for panels at this point. Maybe if you had a panel like in, say, economics, where people aren't doing a lot of, the economists might be griping. I haven't sat in an economics panel this spring, but they're mostly doing data analysis of existing data sets and not a lot of data collection. I can see it figuring into that process a little differently. I'd have to talk to Nancy Lutz, the program director for economics, to find out more. But because everything's sort of a level playing field, everyone's kind of under the same sort of the same mentality and set of instructions. Like everywhere in the world, pandemic is by nature global, by definition, and everyone's sort of faced with these challenges. So they're more interested in whether the more interesting question is not whether the research itself, but whether the question becomes relevant a year or two from now. For example, if somebody was supposed to be studying, I don't know, like what's an event that was supposed to happen this spring that didn't, Coachella or something. Well, there'll be future Coachellas, but something like a sporting event, the Olympics, or the NBA playoffs or something like that. The Olympics we'll say, because it's a periodized event, or if the World Cup was happening this time. If that's being delayed a year, are the questions still relevant? That's where people are likely to ask the questions about the relevance of the project. Certainly there's some projects that you could imagine that just became completely irrelevant because of COVID. I'd also say that probably we're going to see a change culturally in the discipline and the kinds of priorities that we have. Certain kinds of things that seemed like effete kind of intellectual interests probably will be a little less of a priority in the future. And certain things that we didn't think were all that significant may become more important. Certainly digital techniques and digital ethnography is having a heyday. This is a good time for them. It's a good time for Zoom. If you bought stock in Zoom in December, you'd probably be really happy right now. And then certain areas maybe less so. But you tend to see, particularly among anthropologists, a sort of guardedness with respect to jumping on the bandwagon of particular kinds of trends just because they seem kind of important at this particular moment.
Just to build on Alina's question, because it's a really good point, I think, also for graduate students, especially who are applying. And this is not unique to COVID, and not unique to the NSF, but it's shaped by all of those things, which is that people will often think and talk about like the NSF, what does the NSF want? What does the NSF think? Or the SSRC or whatever. But so much of the work is farming out to reviewers who are not part of the NSF as such. And so it's about a disciplinary perspective. And Alina's point is very well taken, I think, in terms of, the sort of lag or not between the framings that are happening in-house and the framings that are happening out there. But do you have any sort of thoughts or comments about sort of how things should be pitched or framed in terms of thinking about the NSF, which is making the final funding call, but is taking very seriously and relying very heavily on the assessment of people who are not in the NSF, right? And so this is what peer review is. This is what science is. That sort of back and forth. How do you see that changing or not? Or do you have any sort of comments on how people should think about that as they're doing their research design and their grant writing?
That's a great question. Not just because of the moment that we're in, but in general. So there are projects, I often joke that anthropology doesn't become science through the transit of property. Anthropology is a science. I do anthropology, therefore I do science. There's a good segment of the discipline that doesn't have a scientific approach. Perfectly interesting work. It's just not science. And we don't have a dogmatic view of what science means in the program. That we haven't, and we don't require, for example, quantitative methods or statistical analyses. We think the reliability and validity of data can be established through a range of different techniques, and cultural anthropology in particular is a good testament to that. We don't require hypotheses and a hypothesis testing model. Tried and true, excellent way of doing things in a deductive kind of setting, a hypodeductive sort of method. But if you're doing something more inductive, and that can still be good science, but the forms of analyses should match up with the approach. So we don't have a dogmatic approach to it, but I would say that there are approaches that are not consonant with what we can fund as a program. So sometimes something will do very well with anthropology reviewers, and we find ourselves in a position of not being able to fund it. There's a project I can think of, a faculty project that a few years ago, sent it out to 7 reviewers, 7 excellent reviews. Panel looked at it. Everybody who read it, it was their favorite proposal. They thought it was just fantastic. Not a lick of science in it, and the panel said, the panel came to the right decision. We didn't have to do it for them, but there was no way we could fund this, despite it being a fantastic proposal. I had this conversation with the PI afterwards, and I'm like, "This is an amazing proposal. There's no chance that we can fund this. I cannot make a case for it." And that just, sometimes you end up with something that's just sort of outside the scope of what it is that we do. So in terms of, there is in some sense the NSF in terms of being an entity with a mission. You can read our mission statement online. It's on the webpage. It says something about basic science. But a lot of it has to do with negotiating anthropological opinions with a general sort of mandate and balancing those. Our job as program officers is to do precisely that. The political anthropologists all love this proposal. They think it's fantastic. And is it inductive enough for us to sort of leverage that as the basis for making a case for it? Or is it, promoting a particular opinion for which it's already drawn a conclusion? Those are the kinds of things that we have to sort of leverage and negotiate. Are we funding too much in this area and not enough in this area? One of the things that's been frustrating about the COVID inquiries is you know, some of us are spending 4, 6, 8 hours a day on just this in the last 2 months, because rapid response proposals, we have to prioritize, we have to answer them first. And we put everything else aside to do that. And so we end up with these 14-hour days trying to do that. And then our portfolio looks all about COVID, which matters right now, but that's not the whole of anthropology throughout its entirety in terms of space and time and so forth. And the same thing happens. Proposals come to the panel. The medical anthropology proposals all do wonderfully. They're all in the high competitive category. And then nary a linguistic anthropology proposal anywhere near the top at all. Again, we have to weigh those kinds of considerations too. You know, implicit biases, the fact that some reviewers rate high and some reviewers, a rating of good is like superlative from them. And some reviewers can't find anything wrong with anything at all. I mean, like these are all things that we have to balance. Every excellent is not, it's not a democracy. I mean, we have to sort of make these judgments are very difficult it's why we have so many people involved in it.
As a last question, we got a question that is wonderful because it's very specific, but also like nicely conceptual. So it can be our last question because we're almost out of time, which is that when it comes to budgets, what about sort of accommodating unique circumstances related to the outbreak, like a per diem outside of the field site, or if technology needed for remote research, or like a research assistant if you can't physically go, or something like that? So like, you know, relating the practical question of budgets to sort of, you know, and this I think is particularly for this current year as things are unfolding, but maybe even further to the future, like any ideas of how sort of the earlier you were talking about, you know, reframing or taking the course, doing this other kind of thing, but that also has budgetary implications. Like what in your mind would seem like a good, reasonable way of thinking about framing budgets in light of these things, about having to sort of do alternative timelines or alternative methods that might not always have you present to the same degree or whatever. Any ideas about that in terms of the nitty gritty of how one budgets the proposal?
So this is one of the tricky things we've seen with folks in the field right now, where they were in the field and they have to come back and they have to live somewhere and pay their rent. And technically, we can't let them do that. I can sort of pretend like I didn't read the email. More or less, and you know, UCI has discretion to allow it, but the reason is that how you get so if you've heard the rule, for example, that DDRIGs won't pay for you to do field work in the U.S. or in you know, in Orange County or whatever, that's not actually quite the case. It's the budget line item that we can fund is called travel, and you can do domestic travel, you can do foreign travel, but you can't live in the place that you continue to live and draw a rent on that and bill it to the federal government. It's not a fellowship. It needs to be an extraordinary cost associated with the cost of doing research. Now, for our purposes in the context of a pandemic, if somebody is evacuating back to Irvine and they're sheltering in place, I think that's you know, a justifiable research expense under the guidance that we've been giving out people. So we've been saying kind of like that's fine, but it's not that you're not drawing rent from your place. You've evacuated from your field site and you're waiting in a stasis until you can go back to the field site again. And I haven't asked anyone in budget for an opinion on that for somewhat obvious reasons. So you can figure out ways to justify these expenses, and they're easier to do in a post-award setting where the discretion is a bit more to the program officer. When there's a lot of eyes looking at it, they want to know the line item that it's on. So it's really hard to justify an expense that's not travel. In the case of hiring research assistants, yeah, that's fine. But people do that all the time. They hire field assistants. It goes under line G6 of the budget, which is other direct costs, a sort of generic catch-all category. Where you don't want it to go is into line G3, or God forbid, G5. G3 is consultants. G5 is something called subawards. This is where you're subcontracting the expenses to some other entity. These are really hard to fund on dissertation expenses because dissertation students are not employees of the university, and it's strange to be asking someone who's not an employee of the university, who's a student there, to now be subcontracting the work of UC Irvine onto some foreign entity. It also requires a really heightened level of scrutiny at the federal level. We have to go through a process of approval to get anything funded under those. Not a big deal on faculty budgets, really tough on student budgets. So my advice is anyone trying to figure out a way to work that into their budget, consult with myself and Siobhan, or your appropriate program officer on how exactly to frame that. Perfectly reasonable expenses because they're related to the research. Just make sure that you're not framing it in a way that subcontracts the work of doing the work of doing the dissertation field work onto some other entity. That they're assisting with the work or assisting with the data analysis rather than doing the research itself.
That sounds great. No, that's super helpful. Well, it is already after 1 o'clock, so I will wrap this up, and I will I mean, your email and Siobhan's email are both easy to find, but I'll remind people of them later so that they can follow up with you. You all are so responsive and so wonderful that way. But I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with all that you're dealing with right now, because obviously there's a lot of concerns and questions and stress, and also hope and opportunity and all of that. But there is a lot going on right now, and to be able to hear from you directly on this is just incredibly helpful to people, and to not just to the students taking the grant writing course, but to all of us. So thank you, and everyone, please join me in applauding and thanking Jeff for doing this, because we really do appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Anytime you guys have a question, let us know. We're happy to do this.
This is awesome. Thank you. And take care, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.